Reuben's a great speaker, and Google obviously an amazing company. My name's Andy McLeish. I work for a company called Shine, and among other things, we partner with Spark New Zealand to put together and bring the Spark Lab series to you guys. And there have been over 150 of these sessions to date over the last couple of years. That's a lot, and all of them have been exceptional and inspiring in their own right. But tonight, I think we're in for a particular treat with Reuben, and I hope you guys agree by the end. Just a couple of points of housekeeping to make sure that everyone gets the most out of tonight. The first one is that the toilets are just at the back there. There's nothing worse than trying to concentrate on an interesting speaker and busting to go to the loo, so toilets just at the back. In the case of an emergency, in the unlikely event of an emergency, that's the exit there, the same one you came in. If that happens to be blocked, there's an exit at the back there. We can just go out of there in an orderly fashion. I've never done that before. It's quite cool. Third thing is mobile phones or devices, if you could have those on silent, but it'd be great if you could keep them handy, because our Mobi site, which I hope you guys have downloaded, I'm sure you have and have got access to, has got a bunch of useful things that would be great for you to use. The first thing is you can see who else is in the room. Now, you may know a number of people in the room. You won't know everybody, but you can see who else is in the room here, and you can make connections with anybody you like as well. I'm certain that there's dozens of useful business connections here that can help you guys in your roles and in your businesses. So make sure you make the best use of that. And the third thing is that you can ask questions. So throughout the talk, Reuben will be talking, and I've got this little pink iPad here, which isn't mine, but it wouldn't have been my choice of colour, not to worry. And the questions that you ask on the Mobi site will come straight through here, and I can just interject if they're particularly relevant and ask the questions, or else we'll save them for the end, and there'll be a question and answer session then where you can ask questions verbally, but feel free to fire them through at the time. So I think that little Mobi site is a simple, really easy to use digital technology that makes something a little bit more efficient, a little bit more effective, and that's something that Spark are really passionate about in business. Spark firmly believe that businesses that embrace digital technology are ones that achieve success more quickly, they achieve better and quicker returns, and they achieve their potential more quickly than they would have otherwise, which of course is a real ambition of Spark. They're committed to that, and that's one of the reasons that we bring you the Spark Lab series here, to impart some knowledge and some inspiration and enable connections between the New Zealand business community to help us all get where we're going a little bit more quickly. On that note, I just would like to thank all the Spark customers in the room. I'm sure there are plenty here. Without you guys, your loyalty and support, Spark simply wouldn't be able to put on these events, so thank you very much. If you're not a Spark customer, that's okay, you're equally welcome, but I would just ask that maybe you just give a Spark customer a pat on the back or a wee cuddle before you leave tonight and say thanks very much. That'd be great. Which brings me to the topic of tonight's talk, which of course is culture and innovation. Now, innovation, as we all know, is something that all businesses and all CEOs and business owners are striving to achieve. But it's not something that I think the majority of businesses around the world, and certainly not in New Zealand, have managed to master on a sustainable or consistent basis. It's very curious, and I think the answer to that, businesses are starting to realise, is that it doesn't come from a PowerPoint presentation or a consultant, including myself, that would come in for a few days and help companies with innovation. It has to start from within. It has to be built out of creating an environment, a culture, and people that are focused on innovation. And I think there's probably no better example of that in the world than Google, which is why we're very fortunate tonight to have Reuben Halper here to talk to us on culture and innovation. Reuben is new to New Zealand, just a year or so in the role at Google New Zealand. Prior to that, had 6 years with Google in the UK, where he worked primarily in the Zoo, which is the internal think tank at Google. And I would imagine that there are probably very few more dynamic, inspiring and innovative workplaces on the planet than the Google Zoo in the UK. So tonight Reuben's going to talk to us about building a culture of innovation and exactly how they did that. So please join me in welcoming Reuben Halper.
Cool. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to try something new, which is sitting, usually like a case of stage like a madman during a presentation. So I may be getting up and wondering if my hands just start flying about too much of kinetic energy. So really tonight I just want to talk about some of the things that we've, I guess, codified at Google, but also some of the things that are just observations from my time there. if you talk to 10 different people at Google about what makes the company innovative and what are the things that are actually behind some of the success, you may get 10 different answers. There is no one particular thing, but there are some organizing principles, and there are some things that I think that are in the DNA of the company that allow Google to be successful, hopefully over the long term, but certainly over these past 18 years. And with the pace of change that's occurring, it's really easy to forget that Google's just a teenager, right? This is 1998. This is when Larry Page and Sergey Brin started the company. And how many of you used a Google service today? How many of you use Gmail, Google Maps, YouTube, Google Search, Google App? Almost everyone in the room, right? This picture is taken before Google became the household name that it is now. This was not a foregone conclusion. Google actually tried to get acquired by AltaVista and by Yahoo back in 1998. And those companies said no. Those companies were much more interested in keeping people on their own properties, and particularly Yahoo. They didn't want a search engine that got people to answer that might be better than what was on their homepage. Instead, they wanted to keep people on their properties. And so they said no, and Google went and did its own thing. But there is some alternate universe where Google doesn't exist, and a lot of the tools, technology, services that we brought into the world are not necessarily apparent. So this is 1998. It's the typical Silicon Valley story of two folks in a garage. Fast forward 18 years, and first of all, we just had our 18th birthday, so if anybody has a drink, we can now drink legally as Google. So cheers. So, well, actually, no, I have to drink. So fast forward 18 years, it's definitely beyond two guys in a garage. It's 50,000 Googlers plus around the world, more than 100 offices in 50 plus different countries, and more than $50 billion revenue, about $500 billion in terms of market cap. So become quite a big company. And the challenge with big companies is then how do you stay innovative? And I think that's one of the key questions that Google needs to answer over the next 5, 10, 20 years, really taking a long-term focus. What really helps is the fact that we've had this mission since day one. And Google's mission is to organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. And if you think about that mission, it is impossible, right? Information is constantly expanding, evolving, changing. The very definition of useful, you can constantly find new ways to be useful. And in some ways, that's by design, right? You make it impossible by design, and it means you've never actually met your mission. As an organization, if your mission is to become just the market leader, well, arguably then you can achieve it, and perhaps you have nothing to actually shoot beyond there. So by having this deliberately lofty ambition, it allows us to look forward and move forward, more acting as a compass than looking at a mission as a speedometer, if you will. So this is something that was baked into us from the very beginning. This mission hasn't changed in 18 years, even as the very definition of information has evolved. So just with that in mind, I thought I'd show you a little video that encapsulates a little bit of the journey that we've been on. Because again, things are changing so rapidly, it's quite easy to forget just how much the world has changed, and specifically how much Google has changed in terms of what our services look like and what we actually bring out to the world.
When we're trying to name Google, we actually went through thousands of names. The name of the company has now become its own verb in the dictionary. Let's Google it. You can Google it. Google on the internet.
6 simple letters on a plain white page.
Being able to insert this in any language, about any country.
When you're putting a question, then finish your question. Go forward. We have been working on organizing the world's information. Our goal is to digitize all the books. Today, Google announced Gmail. Email for everyone, for free.
Google is mapping the entire world to make it more accessible to people everywhere.
Google is jumping into the mobile market.
Android was built as an open platform for everyone to use and build on.
This is Chrome.
It's a faster, safer browser for the open web.
Google is unveiling what they call the knowledge graph.
We needed to understand the world the way you and I do, as objects and relationships between objects.
Today, Google got another useful feature with Google Now.
We are providing you with answers before you've even asked
One
them.
of my favorite cards is the one that shows traffic data for your commute to and from work.
Think about how far Google has evolved with 10 blue links.
We asked ourselves, how can we assist you right when you need it?
Okay, Google, call the Locker Arts Center.
It's not not just desktops, phones, and laptops anymore.
오케이 구글, 유진이한테 5분 늦는다고 문자 보내줘.
With watches with displays, car consoles with displays.
Okay Google, let's go to the aquarium.
How can we help you get things done in as few steps as possible?
Okay, Google.
Okay Google, show me my photos of Lucas with the HomeKit.
But we have to remember, we have a long way to go. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
So quite a lot packed into 90 seconds there. That video is a few months old, and I would argue that it's very out of date. Right? If you heard the last quote in the end, he's saying we have a long way to go. That's Amit Singhal, who's one of the kind of senior brains behind Google Search. But if you look at the recent hardware announcements that just came out last week, really the future is things that don't have screens, right? The future is basically things like Google Home, where you don't actually have a device that has an interface other than your voice. So these things are changing so rapidly, and then the key question becomes, how do you actually stay at the forefront? How do you drive the change that's occurring rather than just react to it? So if you think about where we started, it was the 10 blue links, right? It was providing the best answer to whatever question you were typing into that search box. We've come quite a long way. So now we have more than 7 different products that have more than 1 billion users each day. And this is way beyond just search, from everything from Android to Google Play to YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. And we really continue to evolve, right? So if you look at all of the different things that we've brought into market, some successful, some not so successful, we're constantly evolving, and that evolution is constantly coming through typically small teams tackling big problems, and then figuring out how does this actually help the company, and how does this help users, and then how does this actually something that we then eventually bring into, I guess, a core competency within the organization. But really what underpins it is this idea of a strong culture and one that's based around innovation, and really in a way that is not just a typical company. And again, this is something that's very baked into the core of Google. So in 2004, when Google went public, part of their founders letter to, part of the IPO founders letter said, we are not a conventional company, we don't intend to be one, or don't intend to become one. So not a company that's just trying to chase quarterly profits, not a company that is necessarily just going to focus on their core business, because the observation of the founders, and a lot of folks who are a lot smarter than me, was that what happens is companies tend to fail when they focus only on their core expertise and protecting that, rather than looking over the horizon to see what's coming next, right? So if you look at kind of business MBA case studies, it's littered with examples of companies that were dominant in a particular area and then failed to innovate outside of that core area and therefore missed the next thing that is coming. And you could even argue that Google, this happened with Google in terms of social, right? You know, if you look at the rise of social platforms and whether Google failed to spot that in order to really have something that was baked into the core of Google, I think that's a very fair criticism. So in some ways, the company is almost paranoid to make sure that we're looking over the horizon and not just trying to protect what's at the core, to make sure that we don't miss the next big thing and that we're suitably invested in what may be coming and what may be important to users in the future. So that leads us to the question of innovation. And really, I think the downside is there's no formula. Even the word innovation, I think, is just completely overused and often used poorly, right? So I think it's important to actually clarify, what do we mean by innovation? Well, Google tells us innovation is the activity of making changes in something established, especially by introducing new methods, ideas, or products. So the very idea that you can even have a formula for innovation is just a fallacy. If we look at this and maybe spin the lens a little bit from a business perspective, Cambridge Business Dictionary defines it as the process of translating an idea or an invention into a good or service that creates value for which customers will pay. Again, a formula to try to create value for customers is just a bit of a silly exercise. But there are some things that you can do to make sure that you're set up properly to capitalize on those opportunities. And really what we believe at Google is that innovation can't be ordained. I think you see quite often organizations that have an innovation unit or a little silo of innovation. And what we've discovered that may not be true for every organization is that innovation has to be infused throughout the company. So you can't actually ordain it. However, you can create this environment where it evolves organically. And for me personally, again, this is my observation, this is my belief, this is what I've learned over about 7 years at Google, is that it comes down to kind of 3 separate areas. One is culture and innovation, and I deliberately lump those 2 together because, again, I don't think you can really separate culture and how you're organized, how the environment that you create with innovation itself. The second is high performance ways of working, and then the third is talent acquisition and retention. So these are the things that at least I personally believe allows us to be successful, both looking backward, but hopefully setting us up for the long term. Cool. So I thought I'd just unpack a little bit of these and kind of give you some headline thoughts in terms of how I see those 3 different buckets and what are some key principles and takeaways from there. So first is this idea of innovation, not instant perfection. Really, what we see, and to steal, I think, a phrase that's on the headquarters of our good friends at Facebook, done is better than good. Right. Now, this doesn't apply to like your doctor. You don't want a surgeon who's done better than good. But at least in the space that we work in, which is primarily bits and bytes as opposed to physical products, that's changing. It's better to be fast than to be slow, right? So really, you want to get something out there. You want to see how it's being used. You want to basically launch and iterate and figure out what are things that you can take away from real-world behaviors that then go and inform your next round of releases and things like that. And really, this just allows you to go faster to market. But also, I think dedication to customer needs, seeing how they're actually experiencing what you're putting out there, getting real-world feedback is critically important. One of the phrases we like to use in my old team is, if you want to see how a lion hunts, you don't go to the zoo. You got to put stuff out there. You got to see how it's being picked up, and then you have to make adjustments and go and iterate from there. And you see this in all of our products, right? Right now, there's probably 200 different search experiments that are going on. And this is just a progression of some of the major improvements we've made to search over the years. But at any given time, one of you is probably part of a very small search experiment. And the way that we typically do these things is we roll it out to 1% of users. And then we see what's the behavior of those 1%. Is it what we expected? Are there tweaks that need to be made? Okay, now let's roll it out to 10% of users. Again, feedback, iteration, improvement, and now we'll roll it out to 100% of users. So it's this constant process of launch, iterate, launch, iterate, launch, iterate, improve. And we see this really across all different product areas. So if you think about software, right, you used to buy a shrink-wrapped packaged software. You'd buy Microsoft Office version 6, and then there would be maybe an update that may be over the air, but then be version 7. If you look at things like Google for Work, or now I believe it's called G Suite and Google Cloud, these things are constantly changing behind the scenes. There's no version number per se. It's just constantly being updated, changed, improved, oftentimes based off of either specific asks from users or just behavioral things that we're seeing in terms of pain points, things like that.
Does it happen with your well-established products as well? Is there continuously people looking to improve things all the time?
Absolutely, absolutely. Every single product. I mean, search is the best example where we will make 200 plus. I think last year was about 500 different changes and tweaks to the search algorithm.
Yeah, right. And that theory of just use the word experiment, which is probably experimenting versus researching, right? I imagine, is research a bit of a dirty word or something you don't do at Google? You put things out, experiment in the real world?
We do both. So we do we still do a lot of face-to-face research. You can't necessarily just, and this is one of the things that we often struggle with at Google is it's a very quant-driven company. It's a company that was started by engineers, and so there's a natural bias to go towards things that can be quantified. And so I can see users' behavior, which will tell you the what, but won't necessarily tell you the why. So there's still a very strong focus on understanding the why of user behavior. I think in the US there's a panel of about 2,000 people who they opt in to essentially tell us what they're searching for. Somebody calls them, I think several times a week if I'm not mistaken, and asks them about things that they're doing in their daily life, and then looks at their search behavior and their browsing behavior and things like that. Okay. I should say, please feel free to chime in with questions. Otherwise, I'll just blather on all night.
I think this isn't working because we haven't got heaps so far. I don't know what the story is.
Cool. So the second point under this idea of culture and innovation is a healthy disregard for the impossible. So again, starting with the mission statement, right? It's an impossible mission statement, to use a really terrible pun. I didn't realize that was going to come out like that. It is really thinking about things not just in an incremental manner. So thinking about things that are 10x rather than 10%. And the idea here is that if I give you a problem, if I say, design a car that can go 1,000 miles on a single tank of gas, you're going to fundamentally rethink what a car is, whether you actually need a car. Is it an engine? You know, am I going to think about teleportation? Am I going to think about other solutions? As opposed to me saying, design a car that goes from 60 miles per gallon to 70 miles per gallon. Right? So if you create a broader challenge, it allows people to reframe the problems a bit, and it allows people to think beyond just incrementality. And it really forces a new way of thinking and hopefully a redesign either of the actual problem and ultimately the solution. So really, we try to do this in everything, though obviously there are things that you're focused on making incremental changes, but in the back of your mind thinking about, is this actually even the right problem to be solving, the right approach to be taking? And really just focusing on setting audacious goals. That's really just a construct in order to make sure that you're not just focused on short-term wins, but instead go for something bigger. A great example of this is an area within Google that's essentially dedicated to this idea of 10x. So this is what you may have heard of with Google X. So they're now a separate division that sits within Alphabet. We had a bit of a restructure because there are quite a lot of things going on within the company. But essentially what they look for is areas where there's a huge problem, where there's potential breakthrough technology, and therefore you could apply a radical solution on top. And so when you take the Venn overlap of those three, it opens up really interesting things that could hopefully change the world. So, for example, think about internet connectivity. There's about 1 billion people more connected to the internet, maybe it's 2.5 billion now. There's still a huge number of people who don't have internet connectivity and don't have the infrastructure that we just take for granted, right? So whether it's fixed line broadband, whether it's mobile towers, things like that take huge amount of infrastructure investments. Those people are not going to be able to get online easily anytime soon. If you think about the breakthrough technology, we have made tremendous strides in terms of what we're able to do with wireless transmission in terms of signals. And we also have a lot more understanding about the dynamics of the atmosphere and what's happening around the Earth. What that leads through in terms of radical solution is something we've actually piloted here in New Zealand called Project Loon. So Project Loon is a way of providing internet connectivity through balloons that stay up in the air and that sail on essentially wind currents and can be adjusted up or down and keeps them essentially in the equivalent of a single latitude orbit around the planet and can therefore provide internet connectivity to thousands, if not millions of people per balloon. So I'm not sure if that made sense, so I'll show you a little video about it.
Sometimes everyone isn't really everyone. Like when people say, everyone's on the internet, because the truth is, for each person that can get online, there are 2 that can't. And when you look closer, that everyone looks even less like everyone. In some places, it's more like 1 in 1,000. In others, it's 1 in 10,000. And in some places, no one's online at all. But what if there was a way to light up the entire globe and finally make all the world's information accessible to all of the world's people? Well, even though today 1 in 3 kids can't get to a real secondary school, everyone could have secondary school come to them. In places where there aren't enough doctors, everyone could be held by doctors in other places. Farmers everywhere could start using better weather data, so everyone could enjoy a bigger harvest. And because small businesses that are on the internet grow twice as fast, everyone could create new opportunities for everyone. But how do we bring affordable internet to everyone? Maybe finding an answer starts with looking somewhere new. Like up, and trying something different, like balloons. That's right, balloons. Because it turns out that if you use balloons, it's faster and easier way cheaper to give everyone the internet than it is to give some people the internet. That's why we're giving it a try, and why there's hope that someday soon, everyone really will mean everyone.
So that was actually piloted here in New Zealand. It was a successful pilot. We're rolling it out with various telecoms around the world. I think they just recently announced Indonesia. You can imagine there are some complicated issues that go along with it if we don't want to be a telecoms provider ourselves, but at least providing that just different way of thinking. And a lot of these things will fail, and a lot of these things do fail. But giving people and giving that space to try something completely different and framing the problem completely differently comes up with solutions that are non-obvious and hopefully will pay dividends at least in some of the time.
What's the attitude to failure and getting things wrong at Google? Is it kind of encouraged as a learning thing, or how does that work?
It's definitely encouraged. I think that there's a huge amount of room. The idea of if you're not failing, at least at some things, you're not trying hard enough, right?
Yeah.
So basically, if you're not doing something that's crazy, if you're not having things that are not successful, then you're clearly just staying within your comfort zone. And that's a recurring theme. It's just to make sure that that you're setting these audacious goals. As we'll get into a little bit later, we have something called OKRs, which are objectives and key results. These are something that go all the way from the highest level and from the company level down to individual teams and individuals, and they're completely transparent. Everybody can see what the company's trying to do and how it flows down. Hitting the OKRs is not necessarily expected because that means you didn't set something that's a stretch enough. So if it's easy for you to achieve, then you're not really setting the right goals.
Right.
So just another example in this space is the work that our Google DeepMind team is doing. So these are the guys that have made a ton of breakthroughs in terms of machine learning and artificial intelligence. The game of Go is an incredibly complex game. Does anybody play Go here? Okay, a couple people. There's more permutations of Go, I think, than there are individual grains of sand on Earth. The thinking was that a machine would not even be competitive in Go for the next 10 to 20 years. But the team took it on as a challenge. It's not like checkers, it's not like chess where you can just brute force it. The game takes intuition and it's just a very different beast. And just by giving themselves a bit of an audacious goal to try to beat the world champion, that forced them to think about how they actually teach a machine very, very differently than they had with some of their previous examples. And a couple months ago in Korea, AlphaGo played Lee Sedol, the current Go world champion, and defeated him 4-1. So really being able to set these audacious goals and in some cases actually meet them. So a very huge accomplishment in the field of machine learning. Perhaps the most important thing that I'll talk about tonight is this idea of focusing on the user. This is something that is absolutely guiding principle number one when you walk into Google. And really the idea is that if you focus on the user and not the competition, then all else follows. Focus on what the user need is, focus on what the user is doing, and how can you make life for them easier. What we call it is show them the magic, or make it so magical that the technology falls away, which I think is very similar to what Spark is trying to do. And if you look at a lot of some of the kind of magic moments and some of the communications and some of the experiences that they have in the market, is very similar thinking between the two organizations. But really what it comes down to is figuring out what are the moments that matter to users. What are the things that they have throughout their day. Larry Page calls it the toothbrush test, right? What are the things that you do twice a day that Google can help you with, right? So from a search engine where you actually type something in to actually taking a step back and going, okay, well, you use Gmail. Shouldn't we be able to just tell you when things that are relevant to you are happening? If you're using Gmail on your phone, you're logged into Google, I can see from your Gmail that there's a package coming. Here, let me give you an update on your package. You've told us in Google Maps where you live, so let me tell you if there's going to be traffic on the way home. So not relying on users to have to actually type in information, but trying to be proactive and give them as much useful information at their fingertips as possible. Same thing with flights, things like that. You see this idea from being reactive essentially to being proactive, and the idea is essentially that a search engine would know what you wanted before you even looked for it, right? That would be the perfect search engine. But really just focusing on the user, whether that be speed and making sure that Google gives you answers as quickly as possible, to transparency, and really just making sure that the user experience is the best possible thing that it could be.
Just a quick question from the floor, mate, from Rowan, which is back a couple of slides. But when you're a startup phase, how do you do 10x when you can't even afford lunch? Was Google 10x from the start, or did they start with smaller steps?
Google is 10x from the start if you look at the mission statement, right? The mission statement literally hasn't changed since 1998, since these guys established the company, which is organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. Again, we become so accustomed to technology that we forget how ingrained it's become in our lives. The fact is that now the power comes from not necessarily the knowledge you hold, right? It's not about rote learning. It's not about necessarily knowing the classics, though there's obviously, in my opinion, still a huge role for that. But the ability to access that knowledge. And that's a very dramatic shift, but one that's only taken place over the past decade or so. So I think it's a question of what is your startup trying to answer, what are your startup trying to achieve? And perhaps it's overly ambitious to say it's something that's 10x in terms of a world-changing problem, but you can apply the 10x thinking to whatever problem you're trying to solve, which at least is how do I reframe it? How do I change it from incrementally to what the competition is doing, to maybe how my startup can approach it in a way that's completely different, not necessarily requiring 10x the resources, hopefully.
Great.
Cool. So again, if we go back to this idea of focus on the user, really thinking about what are the things that can make their lives a little bit better, and making sure that is at the fore. Money comes next, things like that. It's not about how do you make money first, it's how do I make sure that users are going to stick with me, that users find us useful, because it doesn't really matter if you have a great monetization model if you don't have users, right? So a great example is, and perhaps my favorite Google product right now is the investment that we've done around Google Photos. Does anybody use Google Photos here? It's a fantastic, I'll do a little bit of log rolling, I promise this won't just be like Google Song and Dance, but it is a fantastic product. And I just want to show you a couple examples that I think really illustrate this idea of focusing on the user.
Your great-grandfather was a great man, achieved many great things, and took 2 pictures in his life. Army, wedding. Army, wedding. You just took 36 identical photos of a sunset you thought was pretty. Your parents kept all their photos in an album. If their house caught on fire, all they'd have to do was grab the album and boom, memories saved forever. But we leave all our photos on our phone, and then leave our phone on this flight to Baltimore. Bye, photos. If by luck you haven't lost or broken your phone, chances are you have 20,000 photos taking up all your space. You've got group selfies, self-selfies, selfies of people taking selfies, chats, caps, accidental flash, the inside of your pocket, photos of drinks, food you wished you cooked, food you actually cooked, big moments, small moments, Wi-Fi routers with really complicated passwords on them because you forgot how to change it to something you'd actually remember. If your great-grandfather wanted to show someone a photo of his wedding, he wouldn't have a tough time finding it. But if you want to show off that photo of you at your friend's wedding, good luck scrolling. Wouldn't it be great if you could find any of your photos by searching what's in the photo? If every photo you've ever taken was safely backed up online for free, so they didn't take up all the space on your phone. Something for the way we actually use photos. Today.
So this is where you start to see some of the intelligence of Google coming together, because it's based on a human truth today, right? How many of you have actually organized your photos? 2 lonely hands. Okay, respect. It's been at the bottom of a long list for a long time. It does things like actually curate it and make it into movies or slideshows for you automatically, based off of what we know about imagery. It automatically backs all these things up. but it also has incredible search functionality to go into the most specific things. And because we have these amazing machine learning algorithms that can identify, with incredible accuracy what's actually in the photo, it allows for you to search for things around location, what's in the actual photo, who the people are, if you assign them names, things like that. So really just taking something that is a nugget, a pain point for users, and taking our strengths and then finding a really nice solution in the form of Google Photos. So that's what we mean by focus on the user. And then even thinking beyond that in terms of how do we make it better for people. So I'm a father. I have a 1-month-old at home. I have a 3.5-year-old boy as well. I spent on his first birthday, or a little bit after his first birthday, I probably spent about 6 hours putting together a really awesome 4-minute video with a perfect soundtrack of his first year. My goal is to do that every year after that. How many times have I actually done that since that first year? 0. So this is I think other people are in the same boat as me, and we're looking at doing things like that with Google Photos. So this is just a concept video of a feature that you'll probably see roll out in the next couple months. So just literally, your face geometry stays the same. We can identify in your photos, even as people are changing in terms of growing up or things like that. Wouldn't it be great if instead of me sitting there for 8 hours, that we actually put together a video that was a year, 5 years, et cetera, and then brought that to the fore for you. So just these little moments of magic where you're just delighting users and they're going, oh, that's amazing, that's awesome. So those are the things that we mean when we say focus on the user.
That is amazing. I've just got a comment here from Jennifer saying the perfect Google search engine looks like it knows what you want before you do. Are you thinking of calling it Google Spouse?
I think we have that in autocorrect, don't we? Cool. So switching gears a little bit and talking about this idea of high-performance ways of working. One of the things that I was blown away by coming from a couple different organizations before Google was basically this level of transparency and the fact that there's both accessibility in terms of up and down the organization. You can kind of ask anybody for some of their time, but also there's a tremendous level of sharing of things that would probably be at a lot of other organizations held very closely. So it's sort of assuming that people are going to be respectful and that people have a vested interest in not leaking things and actually that we're kind of all in this together, if you will. So really we have just radical transparency where we all know what the company's trying to do. We all know what the ambitions are at the most macro of levels, down to kind of different product areas, different geographic areas, down to my team and individuals, et cetera, et cetera. The idea being, if we have this transparency, I know how what I'm doing is contributing to the larger overall mission as well as each step along the way. So you basically end up burning a lot of cycles and internally in terms of politics when you have people who aren't clear on what the goals are between different parts within the organization. If that's completely transparent, then you eliminate a lot of that miscommunication and essentially wasted cycles, if you will. And that comes down to these things, like I said, in terms of public OKRs, but also collaboration across teams and borders. So, and I'll get into this when I talk about talent acquisition and retention, but there's a ton of collaboration that has to occur because we have products that are global. But there's also this idea that really we need to be making sure that people are moving around as they are looking for new opportunities, so that there's a lot of ability to move between different functions within the organization, and that you hired people because they're smart, so you might as well make sure that they have opportunities when they're looking for something new, rather than lose them to a different organization, essentially. So in terms of this idea of transparency, we have something called TGIF, so thank God it's Friday. This is a tradition that goes back to the very, very early days of Google. Larry and Sergey and the rest of the leadership team stand up there for an hour every Friday and talk about what's been happening in the company for the past 6 weeks. So without fail, they're there on every single Friday. Sometimes it's from a different office, but these are guys who, perhaps in a different company, they'd be sitting somewhere else, counting their money or something like that. They're still very much involved. And anybody can ask a question at TGIF. So there's very similar, what we call Dory, but very similar to this in terms of a moderator and question and answer system, and a microphone for those people who are there in Mountain View. And anybody can ask any question about any topic, and it will get answered by anybody on the leadership team. There's some people who are notorious who are asking a question every single week. It's like that guy. But everybody has one, right? And this goes all the way back. So if you look at, this is from 1999 when Google was about 30 people. Right, so. Fairly boring, but again, the idea is that sharing everything you can with the entire organization. And this also goes outside of just our own internal organization. Google is essentially, like I said, it's a very engineering-driven culture, but it's also one that is very much like academia. So the founders were both PhD students, and there's a huge amount of people who've come directly, at least especially in the engineering side of things, come directly from grad school and things like that. So there's a very strong emphasis on making sure that what is done within Google can also be shared outside of Google. So there's a ton of work that's done around open sourcing a lot of the work that we're doing as an organization, whether it be things like data center design, whether it be various APIs, or most recently, as more and more organizations focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence, how do we take the collection of talent that we have and make sure that other people and other organizations are able to capitalize on that? So TensorFlow is open source software for machine intelligence. What does that actually mean? It means things like this. So image captioning systems, for instance, we have something called Cloud Vision API. What this does is these are captions that are actually generated by a machine. So it's looking at the image itself. It's not just saying what's in the image, but it's actually developing captions. So top ones are kind of basically V2, if you will, and below that is V3. So it's getting better and better to the point where it has 94% accuracy in basically being able to caption as well as a human. So these are things that we develop and then not only use on our own internal systems, but then put out into the world so that other people can use them as well. And just on that note, a lot of the products and a lot of the tools that we use internally then become externally facing. So Google Docs is a great example. Does anybody here use Google? So
my kids do.
Yeah, it's fantastic for collaboration, and that was something that was started based off an internal need, and then people said, oh wait, actually this could be something that we could actually develop into a product, and that other people would benefit from, or in this case, get some pain out of.
Good song.
Hopefully that's not what collaboration means in your family or organization, but just a great use case. And again, something that it's really funny when you use these tools and then you go back to things where you're emailing files around and things like that, you realize just how frustrating and how inefficient it is.
Yeah, just a couple of questions, not specifically pertinent to that slide, but really around I'll read one out. So Kevin asks, in regards to privacy, there's a quote which is something like, if you do not pay for a product, in many ways you are the product. Mm-hmm. That's a bit deep for me, but you probably understand what that means. Do you agree? What is your stance on this in regard to data capture, advertising and machine learning? And I guess similarly, there's a couple of other ones just around trust of Google search giving you the right answers and being completely above board. And I think there's something in the newspaper today around politics of what Google's serving up and that sort of thing in relation to always looking for what the users want. How does that kind of work?
I guess there are two separate questions. So the first one around, and it's a very often bandied about phrase, which is, if you're not paying, you are the product, essentially, or you are the, sorry, can you repeat it?
If you're not paying for the product, in many ways,
you are the product. Yeah. It's a value exchange, right? It's constantly a value exchange. I think you're seeing more and more options for people to have ad-free experiences. I think it's a bit of a false narrative in that it assumes that advertising can't be useful and or relevant. So if you look at what things like YouTube, when you have skippable ads, where advertisers don't pay unless somebody chooses to watch the ad and users are able to skip it, there's a value exchange there that is very different than forcing attention and forcing interruption on people. I think it remains to be seen whether all of these products and services can exist in a non-ad funded model and whether people are willing to actually pay for them. We have something called YouTube Red, which is available here in New Zealand, that allows you to pay for YouTube and get ad-free YouTube. I think you'll probably see other services trialing it, but I think when it comes to people putting their money where their mouth is, most people, if the ads are relevant and if they are useful to them, will happily take a free service rather than pay for it. And I think then it becomes a question of responsibility on the part of both the platform provider, if that's Google, and the actual advertiser to make sure that they are relevant and useful. To the privacy question, I guess there's always that's always something that we're incredibly sensitive about. And the key thing for us is that we have to have user trust, right? That is, if users don't trust Google, they're not going to use Google's products. And that's why we have this relentless focus on the user. We only collect as much data as we are explicitly asking you for. So if any of you logged into Google services over the past couple months, there would have been very, very clear and transparent notifications about what we do with your data, and actually asking for explicit approval on whether we can use your data to do X, Y, and Z. That data is often used to make the experience better. And so then again, it becomes a question on the part of the user, do I want to allow for the capture of this data to allow me to know what the traffic is on the way home? Or am I sensitive and I decide that actually, you know what, I prefer that you not. The key thing is that we always go for opt-in as opposed to opt-out, right? So don't assume that people, they have to make a decision to do something, and don't assume that they're going to opt out.
Right.
Or that you, by default, essentially.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Did that answer? Yeah?
Cool. All right. Thanks, man.
Cool. So has anybody heard of Hippo? The idea of Hippo, highest paid person's opinion? Right. Everybody's been in a meeting where you have Hippo, where it's like, I know you're fundamentally wrong, but you're more senior or you're paid more than me, and therefore we're all going to have to eat the decision that you made, even though it's completely wrong. We try to avoid that and we care about that deeply. This is a great quote from Jim Barksdale. He used to be the CEO of Netscape, which says, if we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. Right? So really what we try to do is avoid that latter part. Like I said, we're a very engineering-driven organization, so we want to make sure that we have data to make decisions. And really, that's not about trying to brute force people. Let's actually use data for consensus and not just have whoever can shout the loudest, things like that. But also, it really helps to eliminate some of the politics that go behind things. And again, a lot of these things overlap with each other. So this culture of experimentation and testing means that there's a very low risk to try out things. So if we don't have data, why don't we have data? Okay, let's do an experiment and find out, is my opinion right or is your opinion right? And let's run an experiment and let's do a split test, and then we'll know, and then we don't have to argue about it. So really, it's about trying to make decisions with as much kind of scientific rigor and analysis as you can, not just whoever is the highest paid person.
And I guess you have to balance that with slowing down a process as well, don't you?
Yeah, I think I think it's, again, we're a bit privileged in the fact that we're trafficking in bits and bytes, right? If you're a consumer packaged goods company, it's a lot harder for you to shift the supply chain and to shift the factory line to do split testing. But there are different areas that you can do it, whether it be around communications, things like that.
Yeah.
I think within Google, it's become so embedded in the culture that essentially experimentation is just how things are done, as opposed to imposing additional resource overhead. The thing is that we actually do this not just on our products, but on ourselves. We don't have HR in Google. We have something called people ops, because engineers hear HR and they go, no. They hear ops and they're like, oh, okay, well, there's ops, it's operations, it's rigorous, that's it. But actually, we do try to make the decisions that we base in terms of promotions, in terms of hiring, on the same sort of rigorous approach that we would use in terms of product feedback and things like that. So this is, for example, something that basically a survey that is done within the organization called Google Geist. And what it's doing is it asks every few months, about every 6 months, questions about your team, questions about how you feel about Google, questions about how you feel about your manager, your manager's manager, and then essentially produces a report that shows how particular teams are doing, how you as an individual think, how your direct reports are doing, versus the rest of the company, versus your product area, et cetera, et cetera. So it allows you to take the pulse of the company in a way that you can then start to see where there's positives, negatives, et cetera. We also discovered a few years ago that the best predictor of how a team operates is not necessarily the talent that's on that team, but the manager itself. And there's a huge, huge variance in terms of how teams perform, and a huge variance in terms of the actual managers. So we undertook a project, or the People Ops team did, called Project Oxygen, that tried to look at the different dimensions of what makes a great manager, and essentially codified them into 8 different areas, and then essentially started doing surveys to understand where managers across the organization were excelling or perhaps underperforming, et cetera, and then we're able to then provide coaching, feedback, things like that, based off of those areas. So perhaps most importantly is this idea that, well, ideas come from everywhere. So Google has something famously called 20% time. Really, this allows people to work on things that aren't core to their job, but may be interesting for the organization. If I'm honest, in reality, it ends up being more like 120% time, right? In theory, there's a day a week that you can just explore something that's tied to your passion. That doesn't really scale well, right? It doesn't. If you have 50,000 people and you're losing them for one day a week, it's probably not the best thing. But when people are passionate about something, they do have the opportunity to explore a different project that may be useful within the organization, even if it's not within their core function. And really, it comes down to this idea that if you give people freedom, they're going to amaze you. And also, you don't want to lose people. So if there's something that they're passionate about that's not in their core role, this may give them an opportunity to move into different parts of the organization. So we've actually now codified this into something that's called Area 120. So we used to, like I said, used to have 20% time. Now we actually have basically a program that allows people to kind of leave their day job, essentially submit a proposal, leave their day job for 6 months, and often it's kind of like a hybrid incubator sort of thing. And then after 6 months, them and whomever is working on the project, that either gets kind of funded, if you will, or sometimes people leave and then start it as their own company, or maybe something that Google invests in separately.
Is that the main sort of source for people's ideas to get up? Or I've got a question here from Dimitri. How do you deal with new ideas and projects? Do you have a process to find them, assess them, and validate them? If everyone's spending, I know they don't, but if everyone's spending a day a week thinking up new ideas, there must be a lot of new ideas.
Yeah, they're quite. There's often different kind of sprints and things like that within different product areas to look at actually how do we approach some sort of problem. There's also a ton of, just going back to the sharing thing, there's a ton of people basically talking about product improvements and things like that. So there's a lot of things that are codified within the organization. If you submit feedback on a Google product, if you're, you know who to reach out to in terms of who's responsible for a particular product or a particular area. there's a number of different avenues, and for people to either suggest, I guess, improvements, but also to maybe point out things that aren't working. And then there's often almost a kind of hackathons, if you will, around particular areas. So there's kind of a bunch of different outlets to make sure that you don't have good ideas wasted or not being able to be acted on.
Yeah. Okay.
So externally, an example of basically is ideas coming from everywhere is we allow our homepage, our logo, which is usually sacrosanct in the world of advertising, to basically be tweaked, to be messed with every day. So we have a team that does this, but we also open it up to school kids every single year through a program called Doodle for Google. So we ran this in New Zealand last year. The theme was, if I could travel back in time, I would. And the national winner was Oliver Lonsdale from Wellington, and basically this was his doodle, and this got featured on Google's homepage here in New Zealand for a day. So really the idea of Google's doodle and kind of messing with the logo. We have a team that does great stuff, but school kids are coming up with unbelievable ideas and things that rival the team that's just working on that as well. Another great example recently is cardboard. So again, this was an idea that somebody said, why is VR so cumbersome, and why does it have to be a $600 headset? I bet we could do something clever. And that was just a 20% project that then, if it's a good idea, they're usually it's fairly easy to get a team on board with you. And so you can get other people who are willing to come along for the journey, help you out, and those things start to build momentum a little bit. Cool, I'll try to bash through these just because I feel like probably a bit behind in terms of time. 7? Okay. When are we supposed to wrap up?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, cool. Good to know. We like to hire smart people, essentially. So, but what's critical here, I think, for all of your organizations is set the bar high and resist good enough. So it doesn't matter if somebody's perfect for a particular job. If they're not going to be a good long-term fit in the organization, we'll often take a pass on them. And the reason is basically all it takes is one person pooing in the pool, right? Everybody has to empty the pool. Everybody gets out of the pool, right? Or as Steve Jobs, I think, used to say, A's hire A's, B's hire C's, right? So if you hire good enough, it kicks off a chain of people who perhaps, it has a knock-on effect that nobody wants. We used to ask really stupid brain teaser questions that people were obsessed with. We don't ask those anymore because they're not actually predictive of anything. So we went back and looked at how people actually did on those questions, and it actually doesn't tell you much. We used to go back and look at, when I got hired, I had to provide my SAT scores. If anybody knows what SATs are, these are the end of high school tests that you need to take. It turns out they have no meaningful prediction in terms of your performance. So our HR team, People Ops, does make fundamental changes to the hiring process based off of data. And they're able to go back and say, look, once you've been out of school for a few years, dimension X, Y, and Z has no prediction on how you're going to perform within the company. So let's just stop looking at that. And so to my point about role-related knowledge, as you can see, role-related knowledge is only one of 4 key components that we actually hire on. So again, you could have the person who's the best fit for that particular role, but if they're not somebody who you think is going to be a good fit within the organization, oftentimes they won't be hired because it's a hell of a lot more costly to acquire new talent than it is to retain it. So you're trying to hire somebody for a career, not just that individual role. And this really goes back to this idea of investing in growing talent. So again, there's a whole ton of slew of programs around personal development. The idea being that everybody has something to share with each other. So whether they're kind of informal Google to Google programs, but then also really making sure that when people are bored, they're not going to leave the organization. They're going to stay in the organization. And so that you're not having to acquire new talent, that you're finding another home for them. Touched on this a little bit before, but again, making sure you have good managers. And then also making sure that we're being good citizens, right? So not just thinking about how current Googlers are developed, but thinking about the next generation. So here in New Zealand, we partnered with a variety of organizations to make sure that we're helping to contribute to get good, strong candidates into STEM. And that's really an area of focus for us here in New Zealand. And so really figuring out what are the different components, what are the different pieces that high school students need to learn and get the fundamentals of computer science. The same is true on the other side, though. It's all well and good if you have great students. If you don't have great teachers who don't understand what's happening in terms of technology, it can often be hard for these students to be recognized and to be basically find the right path for them. So we've also invested heavily in terms of partnering. I won't even try to mangle the name because I do every time, but partnering with different teaching organizations to make sure that they have the skills to bring all these digital technologies into the classroom. And then last but not least is actually taking what we know and what we've learned in terms of things like hiring, things like developing managers, and then putting those out into the world. So if any of you are interested in organizational change, if any of you are interested in kind of affecting change within your organization, or think that there are some things that are broken, I would highly recommend checking out this site called Rework. Maybe there's an answer there, maybe there's some inspiration. Not saying that we have all the answers, but a lot of what we learned, we like to try to help folks not make the same mistakes that we did. Yeah, and then last but not least, just giving people a license to pursue dreams, right? So that this work should be challenging, the challenge should be fun. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're bored, then there's something wrong, and we allow people to actually pick projects. It doesn't mean people can just pick up their desk and decide they're moving to New Zealand, but I'm not just going to say, okay, I'm done, you know, and bye-bye. But if I'm not feeling challenged in the organization, there's typically an outlet for me. So this is how I ended up in New Zealand. Loved what I was doing in London, was maybe a little bit ready for a change, and there were a number of different places for me to go, both within London, but also within the different geographies around Google. So there's constant mobility and people moving geographies or product functions.
At the other end of boredom, I guess, is burnout, maybe. Do you have a problem with people being so passionate or so involved?
I think you have a bit of a problem because it answers the question of what happens when you get 1,000 type A people in a room.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have 1,000 gold star kids and they're all trying to excel each other, I think that's actually a problem. So there's a lot of stuff that's put in place to try to make sure that there's an active work-life balance, and it's not just Johnny one up.
Okay.
So yeah, so really those are just a very quick whistle-stop tour through those sort of 3 different areas. Hopefully it was somewhat insightful or interesting. But if there's any questions, happy to take them.
Any questions from the floor? Ones that I haven't asked here. There's a couple I can go through. I can go through a few of those. One of the things I'm interested in, though, is you mentioned at the start looking over the horizon, what's coming up next. Do you have sort of systems or processes for doing that? Or, you know, I know you mentioned that you try to solve, you know, massive problems that can be solved with disruptive solutions. How do you identify those and work out what's going to happen?
People smarter than me.
Yeah, right.
I don't have a good answer to that, to be honest.
Right.
I think some of it is let 1,000 flowers bloom. There's some obvious things, right? If you look at artificial intelligence and machine learning, that is a bet the company initiative, right? There's if you look at the sort of history of computing, there tends to be a wave of essentially 10-year evolution/revolutions, mobile being the most recent. We think that AI and machine learning is going to be the next one. Okay. And really, if you look at the red thread that underpins all of the recent hardware announcements of the Pixel phone with Google Assistant, the Google Home Assistant that's like Amazon Alexa, the red thread in all of that is essentially having artificial intelligence baked in at its core.
Right. Okay. Something we were talking about before we started here is that idea of small startups and smaller companies have the luxury, I guess, of not having a whole lot of structure in place, so that allows them to be nimble and quick. And how Google has gone to did you say 50,000 employees, which
Plus,
is a sizable company by New Zealand standards? How do they manage to stay nimble and fast and avoid the inertia that comes from too much structure and framework?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges of the organization is how do you get these, how does culture and innovation scale essentially? And part of the specific decision-making process that happens within Google is to maintain as flat a structure as possible, knowing that there's a price that you pay on either side, right? So if you go into a hierarchical structure where everybody knows what's going on, you lose that speed, you lose that nimbleness because it's a command and control structure. It has to go up and down the chain. Conversely, if you have a flat structure, you have an incredible duplication of effort and quite a bit of wastage. So you may have 2 teams that are working on the exact same thing. One's in New Zealand, one's in Australia, one's in Mountain View, one's in New Zealand. And so the decision within the company is actually flat allows for innovation, even if it does mean that you're going to have duplication of effort and things like that.
Yeah, right.
But I'd say that's the approach that Google takes. I don't think there's a great answer, and I think, even if 50,000 is large, but I do wonder how it happens when you look at companies that are an order of magnitude larger, and whether it's possible to maintain that, and it remains to be seen.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor before we finish up? Yeah.
Does Google invest in startups?
Not directly. If there's with the reorganization of Alphabet, you essentially have kind of core Google, which is Google, YouTube, the things that I essentially showed. You have other areas. Alphabet is a holding company, one of which is called Google Ventures, and Google Ventures does invest in startups. And the whole kind of USP of how they invest is that they're able to then tap into expertise within Google to then help out those individual startups, so whether it be design, engineering, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of non-direct investment of time and resources. So in London, we had something called Campus London, which was essentially a co-working space and mentorship program for different companies that was funded by Google. And there's often mentoring programs and things like that to at least, at the very least, help out startups with how do you do your digital marketing, things like that. So there's kind of a spectrum from Google Ventures investing directly over here to, I think, maybe some toes in the water here in New Zealand, which, should we be getting involved with some of the incubators and helping out there? Are we wanted there? Would we be adding value, et cetera?
Are you guys just in Auckland or around?
Yes, so most of us are in Auckland. We're a very small team here. We're about 20 people on the ground. There's a couple of people in Wellington as well, mainly focused on government and policy. But we're often down here as well.
Anybody else?
Yeah. So, just one quick question. Towards the start of the conversation, you talked about how innovation can be ordained and the whole organisation. But Google does run Google X, kind of the project 120 you're talking about. Still kind of the other closer to the problem when you do the whole organisation, you still have teams that seem to be charged with innovation.
So I'll just repeat that for the millions of people watching at home. So your question was around how do you fuse the combination of having departments, Google X and Project 120, that are there specifically for innovation at the same time as creating a culture where innovation should be everywhere and in everything. Is that right?
Yeah. They're definitely in somewhat in opposition, but simply put, Google X is there to look at things that have no obvious path to monetization, right? So hence the reason why you see some of the split in terms of Alphabet, right? What you're seeing is now actually here's core Google, and then here's Verily in terms of life sciences, Google Venture, X, et cetera. Those are problems that you wouldn't necessarily tackle in the search team, for instance, right? Or in Gmail, things like that. I'd say, so that's on the one side, which is going back to the original point of looking over the horizon. They're probably not even over the horizon. They're New Zealand and and the rest of the organizations in the UK, right? It's completely over on the other side of the globe, if you will. In terms of Area 120, I think that's to make sure that we're still able to have 20% time, but then essentially what you see is people leaving the organization, going and starting their own thing, right? So I think it's more of a response to that, which is how do you, if there's areas that may not be, they're not over here with X, but they may still be adjacent, then how do you make sure that you can still keep them in the organization, give them all the tools that they need to potentially do their own thing, and keep them, as Lyndon Johnson said, right, it's better to have somebody pissing in the tent out rather than pissing in there, to blow the metaphor. But yeah, essentially. Yeah.
Did that answer your question? Lyndon Johnson and Tenson. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions before we wrap up? Yeah.
I want to find out your learnings from the Google Plus fiasco that kind of happened.
Yeah.
What did you get out of that? What did you learn from that experience?
I didn't work on Plus, so I guess I would have personal observations rather than things that would be representative of the company. I'd say that network effects matter. Right, and that a Me Too strategy doesn't necessarily work, so that you need to find a key USP. Google Plus still has quite an active community, not the same order of magnitude of Facebook, but once they pivoted and went to communities of interest, then they found that people actually, that was the right area. And rather than the first time around, which felt a little bit too much to people, like this is just another social network with a stream. So you need to find what's your USP, right? What are the things that are different about you as a social network? But I think what you did see actually was that there's huge benefits in having people that have essentially a unified experience across Google. And so in some ways, as a standalone social network, it wasn't a success. However, having a unified Google, I think it's quite successful because you see how beneficial it is to have a logged in experience across these different platforms. So when you go from your TV to your tablet, your YouTube watch later is the same and can pick up exactly where you left off. When I search on desktop in terms of restaurants in Wellington, then when I pick up my phone, it has the most recent restaurants that I search for and then directions to them, things like that. So I think it probably didn't achieve its aims on one hand, but it enriched that idea of actually having a unified experience, enriched it across all different Google properties, if that makes sense.
Great. Okay, well, look, I hope you guys have enjoyed tonight. I certainly have, and I'm sure that you've enjoyed it. Just learning how innovation is baked into a company like Google, through those three pillars, but within the 9 things within those pillars, I think is just fascinating. And if it can work for a company of 50,000 people, it can certainly work for one of 1 or 2, even if you're only applying that sort of thinking to yourself, sitting in your garage or at home. I think it's been really useful. I hope it's been useful to you all as well. So I'd just like to thank very much Spark for putting on the event. Thank you to all the Spark customers for enabling this to happen, and most of all, of course, thank you very much to Reuben for tonight. So guys, we've got a little bit of time left. Reuben's going to be here for you to bombard him with kind of personal questions, so feel